The wind was a blade of ice, honed on the jagged peaks of the mountains and driven into the heart of the wilderness. It screamed a merciless song, tearing at the thin wool of Alara Vance's cloak as if it were tissue, seeking the warmth of her life with a predator's instinct. Each step was a battle against a frozen tide, her boots sinking into snow so deep it felt like the earth was trying to swallow her whole, to drag her down into a final white oblivion. Her horse, a loyal gray mare named Ghost for her quiet spirit, had fallen miles back, its strength finally surrendering to the relentless blizzard. Now, there was only Alara and the overwhelming, deafening roar of the storm. She was a flickering candle flame in a hurricane, a single, desperate spark against an entire world of cold. Her hands, numb and useless, were tucked into her armpits, the small, cold weight of a silver locket the only thing she could truly feel against her skin. It was a ghost of a memory, a testament to a life of warmth and learning and love that now seemed like a story told about someone else. The betrayal that had cast her out into this frozen hell was a fire in her memory, the cruel, possessive eyes of Silas Croft burning brighter than the blizzard. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted a beautiful object for his collection, another testament to his wealth and power. When she had refused to become a gilded cage bird, his charm had curdled into a tyrant's rage, and she had been forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror that gave her legs a strength she never knew they possessed. But that strength was failing now. The cold was a creeping poison, seeping from her extremities into her core, promising a quiet, dreamless sleep from which she knew she would never awaken. The majestic, terrifying beauty of the snow-laden pines, each one a silent, white-robed giant, seemed to mock her struggle. They had stood here for centuries. She would last only a few more minutes. Her vision began to blur, the swirling white flakes coalescing into a soft, inviting haze. A tear froze on her cheek, a tiny diamond of sorrow. She had been a scholar, a woman who believed in the logic of the world, in the resilience of the human spirit. But here, on the edge of existence, logic was a forgotten language and her spirit felt as brittle as a frozen twig. She stumbled, her knee striking a half-buried rock, and the impact sent a shockwave of pain through her exhausted body. She fell, not with a cry, but with a soft, final sigh, her face landing in the cold, soft powder. The world was tilting, the roar of the wind becoming a distant lullaby. The last thought that flickered through her fading consciousness was not of Silas, not of her fear, but of the cruel irony that she would die in a place so vast and empty, utterly alone and forgotten by all. The last rays of sunlight were a distant, hazy memory, lost behind the iron-gray curtain of the storm. It was in this moment of final surrender, as the white darkness began to claim her, that a shadow fell over her, a shape as solid and dark as the mountains themselves, blocking out what little light remained. Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight, a cold stone in your chest? Have you ever wondered if a single person could make a difference in a world that seems indifferent to your struggle? This is a story about that kind of loneliness, about a woman cast out into the unforgiving frontier and a man who had made that same frontier his fortress against the world. It is a story that asks if a heart, frozen by grief and loss, can ever learn to beat warmly again, and if courage can be born not in the absence of fear, but in the very heart of it. This is the story of Alara Vance and the Cherokee warrior who found her, a man who had forgotten what it meant to live until he was faced with saving a life. The shadow that had fallen over Alara was not a trick of the fading light. It belonged to Kalen Blackwood. He moved through the blizzard not with a struggle, but with a grim acceptance, a part of the landscape itself. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a mask of stoic resolve, his eyes holding the deep, quiet sorrow of a man who has seen too much of the world's cruelty. He was returning to his cabin, a sanctuary he had built with his own hands high in the mountains, a place where the ghosts of his past were his only companions. He had lost his wife and child to the white man's sickness years ago, and with them, he had lost his place in the world. He had retreated from the sprawling towns and the so-called civilization that had brought him nothing but pain, choosing instead the harsh honesty of the wilderness. He preferred the company of the wind and the wolves to the hollow words of men. When his keen eyes, trained to spot a deer track in hardened earth, caught the splash of dark color against the snow, he had approached with the wary caution of a predator. He expected a fallen animal, a prize for his larder. He did not expect to find a woman, her face as pale as the snow she was buried in, her breath a faint, barely visible mist. A curse, low and guttural, escaped his lips. This was a complication he did not want, a piece of the outside world, of the very society he had abandoned, delivered to his doorstep by the storm. His first instinct, the one born of years of self-imposed isolation and deep, unhealed wounds, was to turn away. It was not his fight. The mountain was cruel. It took what it wanted. But then he saw it. The faint, stubborn flutter of her eyelashes against her cheek. The almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. There was life here, a flicker as tenacious and as fragile as the one he guarded within himself. His honor, a thing forged in the traditions of his people and tempered in the fires of personal tragedy, warred with his desire for solitude. It was a short, silent battle. He could not leave her. To do so would be to kill the last vestige of the man he once was, the man his wife had loved. With a sigh that turned to a cloud of white in the frigid air, he knelt, his movements economical and sure. He slid his strong arms beneath her, lifting her from her snowy grave. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold wool and brittle bones. As he cradled her against the solid warmth of his chest, her head lolled against his shoulder, and the silver locket she clutched slipped from her fingers, falling open against his buckskin jacket. He glanced down, and for a fleeting moment, his stoic mask faltered. He saw the tiny, smiling portraits of an older man and woman inside, a symbol of a life, of a family, that was now in his hands. He adjusted her weight, turned his back to the raging wind, and began the slow, arduous journey back to his cabin, carrying the fragile burden of a life he had not asked for but could not refuse to save. Alara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and pine, a gentle warmth seeping into her skin. For a moment, she believed she was in a dream, a final, kind hallucination before the end. The roaring of the wind was gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic crackle of a fire. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids felt heavy, weighted down with an exhaustion so profound it was like a physical shroud. A low groan escaped her lips, and the sound was alien in the quiet room. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the soft firelight. The room was small, a single space built of rough-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud and moss. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames dancing with hypnotic grace. The air was clean, filled with the scent of burning cedar and something else, something savory like broth. Her gaze traveled from the fire to the man who stood beside it. He was tall and broad, his presence filling the small cabin. His back was to her, but she could see the long, dark braid of his hair, the powerful set of his shoulders beneath a simple linen shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, stirring something in a black iron pot that hung over the flames. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through the warm haze of her recovery. Where was she? Who was this man? The memories of her flight, of Silas's fury, of the bone-deep cold of the blizzard, came rushing back. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the soft furs that covered the cot where she lay. The movement caught his attention. He turned, and she found herself looking into the darkest, most intense eyes she had ever seen. They were eyes that held the memory of ancient forests and the pain of deep sorrows. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, a face carved from the mountain rock itself, yet there was no malice in his expression. There was only a quiet, assessing stillness. He held a wooden bowl of steaming broth, and he approached the cot slowly, as if not to startle a wild creature. He didn't speak. He simply knelt beside her and held out the bowl. It was an offering, a gesture of profound and simple kindness that cut through her fear. She looked from his unreadable face to the bowl and back again. Her pride, the last remnant of the proper, educated woman she had been, warred with the primal, desperate hunger that gnawed at her belly. He seemed to understand her hesitation. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep in the earth. "Eat," he said. It was not a command, but a statement of necessity. Her trembling hands were too weak to hold the bowl, so he lifted the spoon, bringing a small amount of the rich, warm liquid to her lips. She hesitated for only a second before parting them, accepting the nourishment. The broth was a miracle, a wave of life and heat that spread through her chilled veins. It tasted of wild herbs and roasted meat, the most delicious thing she had ever consumed. He fed her in silence, his expression unchanging, his movements patient and steady. When the bowl was empty, he placed it on the small, rough-hewn table beside the cot. He then turned his attention to her feet, which were propped on a low stool near the fire. They were wrapped in clean bandages, and he gently unwrapped one, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he inspected the angry red skin for signs of frostbite. Alara watched him, a storm of emotions churning within her. This silent, formidable man had saved her life. He had brought her into his home, tended to her injuries, and fed her. Yet he remained a complete mystery, a force of nature as wild and unpredictable as the storm that still howled outside the sturdy log walls of the cabin. She found her voice, though it was little more than a dry, rasping whisper. "Thank you," she managed. He didn't look up from his task, simply nodding once as he carefully re-wrapped her foot. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. It was not an uncomfortable silence, however. It was a silence of substance, a quiet space where trust could, perhaps, begin to take root. In this small, isolated cabin, surrounded by a world of white, a silent agreement was being forged. He would offer her sanctuary. She would have to learn to accept it. Her life was no longer her own. It was tied to the quiet, solemn honor of the stoic protector who had pulled her back from the edge of death. The blizzard did not relent. For days that bled into weeks, the world outside the cabin was a maelstrom of wind and snow, a relentless, roaring white that sealed them in their small fortress of logs and stone. The cabin became Alara's entire universe, and Kaelin, its silent, watchful center. The rhythm of their days was dictated by necessity and the slow, steady pace of healing. Kaelin moved with an ingrained efficiency, his life a pattern of quiet chores. Splitting wood, stoking the fire, checking his snares near the cabin, mending his tools. He was a man who wasted nothing. Not a motion, not a word, not a scrap of food. Alara, at first, could only watch from the cot, her body slowly knitting itself back together. The fever that had gripped her in the first few days finally broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed. As her strength returned, an unsettling idleness began to gnaw at her. She was not a woman accustomed to being cared for, to being a burden. The life she had known, a life of books and intellectual pursuits, felt a world away. Here, value was measured in practical skill, in contribution to survival. And so, she began to find her own purpose within the cabin's four walls. Started small. She noticed a tear in the sleeve of one of his buckskin shirts. With a hesitant gesture, she pointed to his small mending kit, a leather pouch containing a bone-all-sinew thread and a few sturdy needles. He handed it to her without a word, his dark eyes watching her as she set to work. Her stitches were small and neat, a stark contrast to his own rough, functional repairs. When she was finished, she held it up for his inspection. He took the shirt, ran a thumb over the near-invisible seam, and gave a single, curt nod of approval. It was more praise than a dozen flowery compliments from her former life. That small act broke the dam of her helplessness. She began to find other ways to contribute, to transform his stark shelter into something more akin to a home. She organized his sparsely filled shelves, arranging the tins of salt and flour, the dried herbs and jerked meat, into a neat, accessible order. She took over the cooking, learning to make a hearty stew from the rabbits he caught and the wild roots he had stored for the winter. She discovered his small collection of books, a worn copy of Shakespeare, a manual on animal tracking, and a Bible with faded, elegant Cherokee script written in the margins. She would read aloud in the evenings, her voice soft in the firelight, filling the silence that had so long been his only companion. He would sit across from her, sharpening a knife or oiling a rifle, his face an unreadable mask, but she knew he was listening. Sometimes, his hands would still, and she would see a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful in his eyes, as if her words were stirring ghosts he had long tried to lay to rest. He, in turn, began to open his world to her, not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night so that the embers would still be warm in the morning. He brought her a handful of dried leaves and taught her to brew a fragrant, soothing tea that eased the ache in her bones. One afternoon, he sat beside her cot and, using a piece of charcoal on a strip of birch bark, began to draw. He drew the shapes of animal tracks, the delicate print of a fox, the heavy tread of a bear, the sharp, cloven hoof of a deer. He pointed to each one, naming the animal in his own language, then in English. "A why," he rumbled, pointing to the deer. "This is what we hunt. This is what gives us life." It was the longest speech he had made to her, a lesson in survival that was also a lesson in respect for the world that sustained them. In this shared space, in the quiet performance of these daily rituals, a fragile trust was being built. They were two broken people from entirely different worlds, trapped together by a force of nature, and yet, in their shared isolation, they were building a sanctuary. The cabin was no longer just his fortress against grief. It was becoming their shared shelter against the storm, both the one raging outside and the ones that raged within their own hearts. The slow, patient work of mending a shirt, of brewing a cup of tea, of sharing a quiet meal, was also the slow, patient work of mending a soul. The world began to change. The relentless howl of the wind softened to a whisper, and one morning, Ilara awoke to a profound silence. Through the single, small window pane, she saw not a swirling vortex of white, but a brilliant, piercing blue sky. The sun, a stranger for weeks, cast long, dramatic shadows across a landscape of pristine, untouched snow. The great storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world remade, beautiful and treacherous. The melting had begun. During the day, a steady dripping sound from the eaves of the cabin became the new rhythm of their lives. Icicles, long and clear as glass, wept tears of pure, cold water that sparkled in the sunlight. The end of their enforced isolation was imminent, and a new, unspoken tension crept into the quiet companionship they had forged. The world was returning, and with it the question of her future. She was strong now, her body fully healed. There was no reason for her to stay, and yet, the thought of leaving this small, safe harbor, of returning to the world that held the monstrous threat of Silas Croft, filled her with a dread that was colder than any winter storm. The thought of leaving Kalen was even worse. He had become her anchor, her protector, the solid, unshakable center of her fragile new reality. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the air enough to melt the snow from the cabin's porch, he led her outside for the first time. The air was so clean and crisp it felt like a tonic in her lungs. The sheer, blinding whiteness of the snow-covered mountains against the blue sky was breathtaking. She stood, wrapped in a heavy fur pelt he had given her, and simply stared, overwhelmed by the scale and majesty of it all. He stood beside her, his gaze not on the mountains, but on her face, watching as she took in the world he had claimed as his own. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "It is," he agreed, his voice a low rumble beside her. "But it is also unforgiving. It does not care if you live or die." He was not being cruel. He was stating a fact, a truth he lived by. It was a warning, a reminder of the reality that lay beyond the safety of their shared walls. That evening, the tension between them finally broke. She was mending a blanket near the fire, her needle moving in a steady rhythm, when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The usual guard was down, his stoic mask replaced by a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. He finally spoke, his voice quiet, breaking the comfortable silence. "Why did you run?" he asked. It was a direct question, the one that had hung unspoken between them for weeks. She put down her mending, her hands trembling slightly. She owed him the truth. She told him everything. She spoke of her life in the East, of her love for botany and books, of her engagement to Silas Croft. She described Silas's charm, how it had slowly twisted into a suffocating possessiveness, how his love was not a gift but a cage. She told him of the threats, of the moment she knew she had to flee or be erased, her spirit crushed into nothing. As she spoke, she did not weep. Her voice was steady, infused with a cold anger and a quiet determination that had been forged in the fire of her ordeal. When she finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Kalen rose from his chair and walked to the hearth, resting one hand on the rough stone mantel. His back was to her, his shoulders a rigid line of tension. "My wife, Lily, and our son, Nayati," he began, his voice thick with a grief that time had not healed. "They did not die from the mountain's cruelty. They died from a fever. It came from a settlement downriver, brought by men looking for gold. Men like your Silas. Men who take what they want and leave only poison behind." He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was a chasm. "I could not protect them. I ran here to forget, to hide from my failure." He took a step towards her, his gaze locking with hers. "He will come for you. Men like that do not stop." "I know," she whispered, her heart aching for the depth of his loss, a loss that mirrored her own in its source. He crossed the remaining distance between them and knelt before her, taking her small, mending-worn hands in his large, calloused ones. His touch was warm and steady, a tether in a turbulent sea. "You will not face him alone," Kalen vowed, his voice a low, fierce promise. "This home, my home, is your sanctuary. I will not fail to protect what is good. Not again." In that moment, something shifted. It was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a declaration of something deeper, something more profound. It was a pledge of allegiance, a weaving together of two broken threads into a single, stronger cord. Alara looked into his eyes, and for the first time since she had fled her old life, she did not feel like a survivor. She felt safe. She felt seen. She felt home. The fragile peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered by a piece of paper. A few weeks after the thaw, Kalen made the necessary, half-day journey to the small, dusty settlement of Redemption, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings that clung to the edge of the wilderness. He went for salt, flour, and news, his senses on high alert, his preference for solitude warring with the practical need for supplies. He moved through the town's single muddy street like a phantom, his face set in its usual impassive mask, drawing wary glances from the prospectors and trappers who loitered outside the saloon. It was on the wall of the general store, nailed next to a notice for a town meeting, that he saw it. A wanted poster, but it was not for a common outlaw. It was for her. The crudely drawn sketch was a cruel caricature of Alara's delicate features, but it was unmistakably her. Beneath it, the block letters screamed a litany of lies, penned by the venomous hand of Silas Croft. It declared one Eleanor Vance a runaway ward, a woman of fragile mind and larcenous intent, who had stolen a significant sum of money and a horse from her generous benefactor, Mr. Silas Croft of St. Louis. A handsome reward was offered for her capture and return, no questions asked. A cold, familiar rage, an emotion Kalen had buried deep within himself for years, began to smolder in his chest. He saw Croft's strategy with sickening clarity. He was not just hunting her. He was poisoning the well, turning every stranger into a potential enemy, every helping hand into a threat. He was stripping her of her name, her sanity, her very identity, making her a pariah. Croft himself was in redemption. Kalen could feel his presence like a change in the air pressure before a storm. He saw the man through the window of the saloon, holding court, his expensive, tailored suit a jarring sight in the rustic establishment. Silas Croft was all polished surfaces and predatory smiles. his eyes scanning the room with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world was his to own. He was surrounded by a handful of hard-faced men, guns holstered at their hips, their loyalty clearly bought and paid for. They were not frontiersmen. They were city thugs, dogs on a short, expensive leash. Kalen tore the poster from the wall, his knuckles white as he crumpled the lies into a tight ball. He bought his supplies with terse, clipped words, his mind already calculating, planning. The sanctuary was no longer a sanctuary. The ugliness of the world he had fled had followed him, had tracked him to his very door, drawn by the light of the good and innocent soul he had taken in. The ride back to the cabin was a grim, silent race against time. The beauty of the mountains, the vibrant green of the new spring growth, was lost on him. He saw only ambush points, places for cover, the tactical landscape of a battle to come. He had invited this danger into his life when he lifted Alara from the snow. He had known, on some level, that this day would come. His isolation had been a shield, but it had also been a form of cowardice. Now there was nowhere left to hide. He had made a vow not just to Alara, but to the memory of his wife and son, to the last shred of honor he possessed. He would not run again. The storm had found them, and he would stand and face the lightning. When he burst into the cabin, his face was a thundercloud, the usual calm of his demeanor shattered. Alara, who was tending a small pot of wildflowers she had placed on the windowsill, turned to him in alarm. She saw the crumpled poster in his fist, the grim set of his jaw, and she knew. Hope, that fragile, tender green shoot that had begun to grow in her heart, withered under the chilling certainty in his eyes. The world had found them. Silas was here. "He is in redemption," Kalen stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which was more terrifying than any shout. He smoothed the crumpled poster out on the table, the ugly words and the distorted sketch a stark violation in the simple warmth of their home. Alara stared at it, her blood running cold. To see her name, her face, twisted into this public declaration of falsehood was like a physical blow. Silas had not just come for her. He had come to erase her, to replace the real Alara with this fictional madwoman, this thief. For a moment, the old fear, the visceral terror of the hunted animal, seized her. Her first instinct was to run again, to flee deeper into the wilderness, to disappear completely. But then she looked at Kalen. He was not looking at the poster. He was looking at her, his dark eyes steady, waiting. And in his gaze, she did not see a man preparing to cast her out to save himself. She saw a warrior preparing for battle. The sight extinguished her fear and ignited something else, a spark of defiance. She would not be that cowering woman in the snow again. This cabin, this man, had given her more than just shelter. They had given her back a piece of her own soul. "I will not run," she said, her voice quiet but as firm as the stone of the hearth. "This is my home now." A flicker of something, pride, respect, warmed Kalen's stoic expression. "Good," he said simply. "Then we fight." The cabin transformed. The cozy sanctuary became a fortress. Kalen worked with a grim, focused intensity that was both frightening and reassuring to watch. He barred the single window with thick wooden planks, leaving only a narrow slit for a rifle. He reinforced the door, bracing it with a heavy log. He spent hours outside, moving silently through the surrounding woods, creating deadfalls and subtle traps on the main trail leading to the cabin, using his intimate knowledge of the land as a weapon. He was no longer just a solitary man. He was the protector he was born to be, every sense heightened, every movement with purpose. He did not try to shield Alara from the preparations. Instead, he included her. He brought out his spare rifle, a heavy, long-barreled Winchester. "You will not hide," he told her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will learn." He took her outside to a small clearing behind the cabin and taught her the mechanics of the weapon. He showed her how to load the cartridges, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. Her hands, more accustomed to the delicacy of a pen or a flower stem, were clumsy at first. The rifle felt heavy, alien, a cold instrument of death. But Kalen was a patient teacher. "Do not think of it as a weapon to kill," he said, adjusting her stance, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Think of it as a tool to protect your life, your home." Under his tutelage, her fear of the weapon was slowly replaced by a sense of its power. She learned to feel its weight, its balance. She learned the satisfying metallic click of the action, the solid thud of the butt against her shoulder. She was not a natural shot, but she became competent, able to load and fire with a steady hand. This act, more than anything, cemented her transformation. She was no longer a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She was an active participant in her own salvation. As they prepared for the coming storm, a new intimacy bloomed between them. They worked side by side, their movements falling into a seamless rhythm. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, not reading, but cleaning the rifles, the quiet rasp of the oilcloth and the click of metal parts the only sounds. They were a team, a unit of two against the world. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Alara's stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She was fighting not just for her life, but for the life she had found here, for this quiet man who had shown her the meaning of honor, and for the woman she was becoming. A woman who would not be broken, who would not be silenced, who would stand her ground. The last rays of sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, a beautiful, ominous portent. They were ready. The quiet life was over. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was on their doorstep. The attack came not at dawn, as they had expected, but in the dead of night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver moon. A single, sharp crack of a twig breaking under a careless boot was their only warning. Kalen, who had been sitting in a chair by the fire, seemingly at rest but with every nerve pulled taut, was on his feet in an instant. He moved to the reinforced door, pressing his ear against the wood, his body a study in coiled tension. "They're here," he whispered, his voice a low growl. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. She moved to her position by the narrow slit in the window's barricade, the rifle feeling cold and heavy in her hands. She could see them now, dark shapes flitting between the trees, moving with a clumsy arrogance that spoke of their overconfidence. There were 5 of them, including Silas Croft, who stood back from the others, a pale, commanding figure in his fine city coat, directing his hired thugs like pieces on a chessboard. "Eleonora!" Silas's voice cut through the night air, smooth and cloying, a snake's hiss wrapped in velvet. "Come out, my dear. This foolishness has gone on long enough. This savage cannot protect you. I have come to take you home." Alara flinched at the sound of his voice, at the possessive, condescending tone that had haunted her nightmares. Kalen glanced at her, his eyes dark with a protective fire. "Do not listen," he commanded softly. "His words are poison." The thugs began to advance, spreading out to surround the small cabin. A shot rang out, and a bullet thudded into the log wall near Alara's head, sending splinters of wood flying. She gasped, pressing herself back against the wall, the reality of the violence a sudden, shocking blow. Kalen didn't hesitate. He moved to the firing slit, raised his rifle, and fired a single calculated shot. A cry of pain echoed from the darkness. He hadn't aimed to kill, but to wound, to disrupt their formation. The night exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the roar of the rifles deafening in the enclosed space. Bullets tore through the log walls, embedding themselves in the wood with vicious thuds. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Kalen was a force of nature, moving between the door and the window, firing with deadly, economical precision. He was not a man fighting with rage, but with a cold, focused purpose. He was defending his home. He was defending her. A new sound reached them, a heavy, rhythmic thud against the door. They were using a log as a battering ram. The reinforced door shuddered, the wood groaning in protest. It wouldn't hold for long. "Alara!" Kalen's voice cut through the din. "The lamp." She understood immediately. While he laid down suppressing fire, She scrambled for the large oil lamp on the table. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear, her fear transmuted into a white-hot, focused energy. The door splintered, then burst inward with a crash. Two of Croft's men spilled into the room, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions a mixture of triumph and surprise. Before they could raise their guns, Alara acted. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she hurled the lit oil lamp. It shattered at their feet, and a wall of fire erupted between them and the rest of the cabin, the flames licking hungrily at the dry wood of the floor and walls. The men screamed, beating at the flames that clung to their clothes as they scrambled back out the broken doorway. In the confusion, Kalen took down another of the attackers with a shot to the leg. Outside, Silas Croft cursed, his voice shrill with rage and frustration. The final thug, seeing his companions fall, lost his nerve and fled into the darkness. Now there was only Silas. He stood in the broken doorway, framed by the fire, his handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of fury. He raised his pistol not at Kalen but at Alara. "If I cannot have you," he snarled, his voice trembling with psychotic rage, "no one will." Time seemed to slow. Alara saw the black hole of the pistol's muzzle, the mad glint in Silas's eyes. Kalen was across the room, his rifle empty. There was no time. In that split second, Alara did not cower. The woman who had trembled at this man's raised voice was gone forever. She lifted her own rifle, the one Kalen had taught her to use. It was heavy, and her aim was uncertain, but her resolve was absolute. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the explosion deafening. Silas cried out, not in pain, but in shock, his pistol clattering to the floor as he staggered backward, clutching a hand that was now a bloody ruin. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, unable to comprehend that his prize, his possession, had fought back. Kalen was on him in a flash, his movements a blur of controlled power. He did not kill the man. Instead, he subdued him with a swift, brutal efficiency, binding his hands and leaving him disarmed and humiliated amidst the wreckage of his own failed tyranny. The battle was over. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the fire that was now beginning to spread. The fire, which had been their unexpected ally, now threatened to become their enemy. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and choking. Without a word, Kalen grabbed a heavy blanket, beat back the flames that were consuming the doorway, and then hauled the groaning, defeated form of Silas Croft out into the cool night air. Alara followed, dragging the two wounded thugs clear of the burning structure. They worked together in the eerie, flickering light, their faces smudged with soot, their movements synchronized by the adrenaline of the fight. They managed to save a few precious items, the books, the mending kit, a small chest of Kalen's personal belongings, before the roof caught fire with a roar and the cabin that had been their sanctuary began to collapse in on itself, consumed by the very fire that had defended it. They stood together and watched it burn, the home that had brought them together turning to ash and glowing embers. They had won, but they had lost their shelter. Silas Croft, his hand crudely bandaged, glared at them with pure, impotent hatred. His power, built on wealth and intimidation, had proven to be a hollow shell against their combined strength and resolve. Kalen looked at the smoldering ruins, then at Alara. Her face was streaked with grime, her dress was torn, but her eyes shone with a fierce, newfound strength. She was no longer the fragile woman he had pulled from the snow. She was a warrior in her own right, a woman who had faced her monster and refused to blink. In the cool light of dawn, Kalen tied Croft and his wounded men securely. He would take them back to redemption, not for the bounty, but for justice. He would tell the town the truth of it, and Silas's own wanted poster would be the proof of his lies and obsessive cruelty. Before he left, he turned to Alara. The silence between them was heavy with all that had happened, all that had been destroyed, and all that had been forged in the fire. "I will return," he said. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a sacred oath. She nodded, her heart too full for words. She believed him. She watched him lead his pathetic captives down the mountain trail until they were out of sight. Then she turned her attention to the ruins. The epilogue of their trial by fire was not one of despair, but of rebirth. When Kalen returned 2 days later, he found Alara not weeping amidst the ashes, but working. She had cleared a small area, salvaged the unburnt logs, and had already begun to lay the foundations of a new, larger cabin, her hands raw but her purpose clear. He stood for a long moment, just watching her, a slow, unaccustomed smile touching his lips. He had left a survivor and returned to a builder. They rebuilt it together, log by log, stone by stone. The new cabin was not a fortress against the world, but a home designed to welcome it. It had larger windows to let in the sunlight, a wider hearth for a bigger fire, and a porch where they could sit together and watch the sun set over the mountains. The slow burn of their companionship, which had been forged in shared silence and quiet care, now blossomed into an open and profound love. They had faced death together and had chosen life. A year later, the cabin was a home in every sense of the word. A vibrant garden bloomed where there was once only scorched earth, Alara's knowledge of botany finally put to joyful use. The sound of her laughter, a sound Kalen once thought he would never hear again in his life, was a frequent melody in the mountain air. They had found more than just survival in each other. They had found redemption. He had healed from the ghosts of his past by protecting a future with her. She had found her own strength by leaning on his. They were a found family, two solitary souls who had built a new world from the ashes of the old. Their love the foundation, as strong and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. Is there any wound so deep that love cannot heal it? Is there any darkness so complete that a single flame of courage cannot push it back? The story of Alara and Kalen is more than just a tale of survival on the harsh frontier. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It reminds us that our past does not have to be our prison, and that the walls we build to protect ourselves can sometimes become the very things that keep out the light. Alara was a woman who was underestimated, cast aside, and left for dead. But within her, there was a quiet strength, a resilience that refused to be extinguished. Kalen was a man haunted by loss, a warrior who had retreated from the world. But in saving her, he rediscovered his own purpose, his own capacity for love and for life. Together, they faced down tyranny, not with an army, but with their shared honor and a bond forged in the crucible of adversity. They teach us that true strength isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand up and fight for what is right, even when you are afraid. It is the courage to open your heart after it has been broken. It is the resilience to rebuild from the ashes and to believe in the possibility of a new dawn. Their love story is written in the logs of their new home, in the furrows of their garden, in the quiet peace they found in a world that had tried to tear them apart. It is a story of hope, a reminder that even in the most desolate of wildernesses, a new life can take root and flourish. What do you think is the most important element for survival? Skill, courage, or love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If their story of redemption and resilience has inspired you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the triumph of the human heart against all odds. Thank you for joining us on this journey.